All right, viewers and listeners, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Good morning and welcome to this special edition of Global Arena, an episode I term as quote unquote Intercontinental Panel Interview on my YouTube channel, Global Arena TV. I'm Umar Isa Dandago and I'm the host of the show. And we are recording in the early morning of Monday, the 4th of November 2024, just a day before the historic attention-gripping United States election between, well, in the words of my friend Andrew Muller, quote, a convicted criminal and one who convicted criminals. Right now, nobody could foresee a definite or a definitive winner until the final whistle is blown. Even though Professor Alan Lichtman, a guy who for about 40 years has been predicting the US presidents, has already put out his prediction. And in my interview with him a few weeks ago, he told me, and he told the world, that it's Kamala Harris, not Donald Trump this time around. Well, the Americans have been deeply divided about who to vote for. And of course, the lesser of two evils phrase is now one of the most pronounced phrases among the Americans, especially from the Democratic voters. Well, on the other hand, both of the candidates have capitalized on the sentiments and emotions of their supporters and are aggressively trying to get more votes. For example, Donald Trump has been relentlessly talking about migrants poisoning the blood of the Americans and eating pets. While Kamala Harris, who Mr. Trump wants to get out, you're fired, and something like that, has been incessantly talking about abortion. Many issues undermine, or rather, many issues determine who becomes the US president, but foreign policy isn't always the top of the agenda. But this year, some Muslim Americans, rather, in the swing state of Michigan, have astonishingly, and some would say unbelievably, endorsed Donald Trump. And they say he's the candidate for peace, while we know that he's a guy who banned Muslims from entering the United States of America, unilaterally pulled the US out of the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, recognized Jerusalem as the capital city of Israel, among others. Well, there is a lot to discuss, including how some media organizations tend to endorse candidates. And, well, I'm joined by the right people to talk about this election. From Dublin, the Republic of Ireland, I've got Gina London, who is a communications consultant and served as a correspondent and anchor on CNN many years ago. Gina London, thank you very much indeed for coming back. This is your show.
It's fantastic to be with you and your illustrious panelists, Elmar, and I appreciate your setup. Hearing the global perspective on something that sometimes I find I have blind spots on because I can be very deep and narrow and, as we say, inside the beltway. I really appreciate the way you set that up. Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed. And I've got from London, Naziru Mikailu, who worked for the BBC Hausa Service, participated in some programs of the BBC World Service, later became the editor-in-chief of Daily Trust, one of the largest newspapers in Nigeria, and he joins us from London. He's currently doing his PhD at University of Westminster. Naziru, thank you very much indeed for being on the show, for coming back rather, as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, Umar, and nice to meet the other colleagues.
Yeah, we apologize to our viewers. Naziru can hear us and we can see a partial view of his face. This is due to a technical glitch and it's being worked on. From Oxford, I've got Hugh Fraser, a former BBC journalist who reported from Russia back in the 90s. And the CEO and founder of StoryNori.com. Hugh Fraser, thank you very much indeed. It seems you have some sympathy towards Donald Trump based on my conversations with you.
Absolutely. I think the world is really waiting with bated breath. And I certainly think Donald Trump will be an enormous improvement over what we have. Yes, I am very much in favor of him. And I think a lot of people actually are more out there saying they're in favor of him this time.
All right.
And that's quite common in Britain, I'd say, as well.
All right, we'll find out in the course of the program. You are joining us from Oxford in the United Kingdom.
Yeah.
Well, let's start with Gina London. I'm going to throw the same question at all of you, but then Gina London, when you were back at the CNN working, how was it for you covering the election? Can you remember some of the moments? Let's have this, what do you call it, memory, going along the memory line or going down the memory lane. Okay.
Sure. I had the privilege of covering 3 elections. So I covered Clinton, I covered Bush, and I covered Bush again. And so I can say certainly notably as we're looking toward this very razor thin, as we're riding the polar coaster on this election that's very too close to call. I recall when I was in Washington, D.C. in 2000, calling the election for Al Gore. He was running against George W. Bush. We had actually called it. I was on air in front of the White House declaring as many words that the polls had closed and that the announcement was official. And then within maybe 25 minutes, I had people in my ear saying, you're on a plane to Florida. There's a question with the balloting and how they were prepared. And for the next then almost 7 weeks, with the rest of the world, in the United States, of course, in particular, I was down there with a whole army of reporters standing in front of the courthouse in Tallahassee where there were hand counts and irregular balloting. And one by one, they were trying to get down to who was going to be the next president. And then to simplify now, the decision was ultimately decided at the Supreme Court. Al Gore conceded. There was a handover without any kind of rush to the Capitol, like we saw on January 6th, 4 years ago, and George Bush did become that president. So I have covered very tight races where there are discrepancies in voting. And I think we have right before us now a very divisive time, very divided country. I live in Ireland, as you said, but I am American, and I did vote by mail ballot in my home state of Ireland, and I'm no longer a working journalist, so I will go ahead and share that, yes, I did put a blue drop in a very red ocean that is the state of Indiana where I vote. But it is going to be a very interesting time. There are
clarify
claims from the Trump side of voting irregularities. Sorry, so go ahead. So it's going to be very...
To clarify for my viewers in Nigeria, you voted blue while I'm wearing blue, meaning you voted for Kamala Harris.
Yes.
Donald Trump.
Yes, red is the symbolism of the color of the Republicans. And if your listeners are aware with the electoral maps as you see them, the quick primer is when you see a blue state, that means it predominantly votes blue. And because of the electoral college system in the United States, except for 2 exceptions, that's Nebraska and Maine, if your state has 51% of the vote goes to a particular candidate, all the electoral college votes, which is the way that the U.S. president is elected, then go toward that candidate. So you'll often hear the race to 270. And what that means is there are 538 possible electoral college votes. Each state gets an allocation based on the number of senators and House representatives. And so those start to be tabulated, and the winner of the majority plus 1, that gets us to 270, becomes the president of the United States. Okay. So that's the quick primer. I'm from Indiana. That state has been voting red for a long time, Republican. I voted for Kamala. That's blue. But it is very unlikely that state is going to flip and there's going to be a majority of blue voters. It could, if so, the 11 votes that go to Indiana would then go to Kamala, but I certainly expect that they will go to Trump.
All right, no problem. That's fantastic. Nazir Mikhail, if you can talk us through how you used to cover the American election back at the BBC and, of course, at Daily Trust in 2020 during the COVID. Talk us through it. How did it happen? How remarkable was it? How busy? How everything was it?
So thank you, Umar. And I have never been on ground in the United States to cover the election. The period that I lived in the US, there was no election between the 2 years that I spent there. There was no national election present. But of course, because because of the power of the United States globally and the nature of its politics, so every media house, majority media house, I have come from Clinton, kind of like leading the team online. We're doing a daily, a kind of like live updates of the results, and then and also on social media. So it was kind of like I was involved in the process because it was a pan BBC coverage across all the language services. So I was representing the House service. So we had to work with all the other 27 language services in the BBC and commission different graphics and analysis about the election, the age, the swing states, and what have you. And it was really, really interesting. But one of the most interesting aspects of it, it was the time difference, because the United States is 6-7 hours behind Nigeria. So you can see the element. So we out the nights when Nigerians were sleeping, and then the United States was election, and then Nigerians wake up, and then the US were kind of like getting deeper into the election night. So it was kind of like a 2-day non-stop kind of like. So we were just taking time to rest in between while ensuring that the coverage continues. So it was a very interesting one. So we're looking to another interesting night, election night from tomorrow.
Yeah.
I remember when Trump went to the stage to say, I just received a call from Senator Clinton, kind of like conceding. So that was really, really a big moment because most people never expected that. So we don't know what happened, whether it's Kamala going to say that I got the call from Trump, or he's going to say I don't know. So it's especially with the issues of some people trying to get it to look for manual counting and whatever in some areas. So we just don't know. But we hope to have, because it doesn't make sense if election is not decided on that night. That election night, it's the kind of like, it's the moment of the election, at least for the media. You want to hear that the AP has called Michigan, has called this in, Fox has now called whatever, Pennsylvania for Trump, for Kamala. You want to hear that moment. Without that moment, to be honest, the election coverage is incomplete.
Yeah, definitely. I can see an outpouring of emotions both on Naziro's and Gina's faces. Hugh, Fraser, if I can come back to you, how did you used to cover the American election when you are a journalist, when you are practicing?
Well, I haven't covered US elections. I've covered them in Russia and Belarus, and they resemble US elections quite closely in that people go to the polls and a kind of fog descends, and you hear all sorts of shenanigans going on, and then the result is announced, and no one really has much faith in the result. Whereas in the UK, which obviously observed what happens to the result, and it seems like a more satisfactory, and all sorts of complicated different ways of voting in different states, and arguments about whether it's hanging chads or whether election workers allowed to be there to observe. I mean, the idea that you couldn't have people observing the counting is a very kind of recognizable. People around outside of America, the foreign policy is the most important. And when you see the foreign policy team that was under both Obama and under Joe Biden, what you see are a kind of merger with the neocons, which is kind of alarming, and a continuation all the way from Bush right to the present. You see people like, Jake Sullivan, and your very incompetent and naive foreign secretary, and the world feels unstable and unsafe. Picking up all over the place, there are revolutions as if it was a reality. And when Trump, both in experience and in rhetoric, talks about wars, the first thing he says is, I don't want people to die, and it's terrible that so many people are dying. And that's a very good starting point, because both sides can agree on that. And you had a lot more stability in the world with those 4 years of Trump. And then immediately he left office, I knew that there would be war in Eastern Europe. And sure enough, there was. I didn't predict the Middle Eastern chaos, but as soon as Trump gets back into office, we'll get into a situation where you have a realistic foreign policy, which is based more on pressure, on economic pressure, rather than on economic pressure. I'm not just talking about sanctions. I'm talking about the very simple and easy to understand system that he who pays the piper plays the tune. So Trump is a businessman. He knows that Netanyahu and Zelensky both depend on the United States to fund their wars, and he will tell them enough is enough. It's not that difficult to understand. So we will have a lot more peace and stability. He's also got the confidence to override officials and generals who just want to go madly off and bomb places. He's very happy to... we saw the chaos of the Afghan withdrawal under Biden. That should be enough alone to want Trump back.
This is fascinating. Quick interjection, and I want to hand it back to you, because it's your show.
Yeah, definitely.
The unpredictability...
I'm just gonna cut him off and get you, Gina Landa. I'd
like to hear what Jim's got to say, because that is a point that I think is a very important one about unpredictability. I think that's really...
was going to be my question about the capitulation right away to Russia that to exist, the unpredictability around how he takes years, that he is very much a fan of Netanyahu, and that doesn't bode well for the Palestinians. I'm genuinely interested, because, and also, by the way, on Afghanistan, he had said he was going to withdraw, but he never did.
Oh, well,
so I agree it was a bad withdrawal, but he had promised for 4 years he would do it, and he didn't.
The withdrawal was scheduled for the spring, and Biden delayed it. So that's why the fighting season had begun, and so it was all badly timed. On the question of unpredictability, that's a very, very important point.
Okay.
Because unpredictability is a very important concept in foreign relations, and that's why immediately Trump was elected in 20. I knew that Putin and people would back off, because not knowing what your opponent might do is a very good reason to be cautious. Particularly, it's called playing your hands close to your chest, not playing your hand. The way Biden and Blinken and people play their hand is, whatever you do, in the end, we'll give you the money, carry on, go ahead. I mean, they're totally predictable, which is why they're just in like Netanyahu and Zelensky have them in their pockets, really. Any amount of money, we'll send it to do what you want.
But
Trump is not like that.
I think
understands.
Fraser, if I can cut you off, okay, your sympathy towards Donald Trump would be unjustified would be perceived to be unjustified by many people, simply because this is a man who moved the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem from Tel Aviv. That caused a lot of diplomatic chaos. He unilaterally pulled out of the JCPOA, Iran nuclear deal, which was meant to bring stability in the Middle Eastern region. And under his watch, millions of children were starved. Many thousands of them were killed in Yemen with American-made weapons perpetrated by the Saudis and the Emiratis and so on and so forth. And another criticism is that many people would not believe a single word Donald Trump says. By picking up a phone and calling Donald Netanyahu or Putin and say stop the war, they just don't think that could happen, or even if it happens, it's going to be at the detriment of the people who are very much affected by the wars.
Well, okay, both sides, to have peace, both sides have got to take concessions. And the Israelis recently, actually, in the Jerusalem Post, or maybe it's the Times of Israel, have said that when Netanyahu met Trump, he gave him an ultimatum that you have to end this war by the time of the inauguration. I don't know if he can force that or not, but certainly he's not going to say to Netanyahu, sure, here's a blank check. That isn't how a businessman thinks. All that Biden and Kamala Harris says is, oh, when the pressure starts, when it looks like politically uncomfortable for them, they say, oh, please, Mr. Netanyahu, please stop bombing. Trump is not going to do that. On the question of Ukraine, I think we just have to accept facts. The Russia has, as it was entirely predictable, because it's a much bigger country, it hasn't caused Ukraine to cease to exist, but it has won in the east of Ukraine, in the Russian-speaking areas, and you just have to accept that. That's the facts on the ground. The alternative is really to carry on a very destructive and deadly war that could always have the chance of turning nuclear through an escalation path, which is of tactical weapons escalating, or even a bomb. It's a very, very dangerous situation, and Trump understands that has to stop because the world might disappear. Nobody in the very naive and foolish the Obama and foreign policy team seems to give nearly enough credence to the dangers of nuclear war and the unpredictability and the sheer destructiveness and waste of wars. Trump talks about money as well as lives. America has 130% GDP to debt ratio. It's going bankrupt, and it's partly because of the trillions and trillions they poured into just destroy. Now, on the question of, well, I could answer your question in more detail about Iran, but I've talked enough.
Yeah, definitely. All right, let's get to Naziru, because Gina is leaving at the top of the hour, and we now have 5 minutes for that. Naziru, briefly, if you can answer this question before we go to Gina. How do you see this election? It's very much neck and neck, very tight. And who is the favorite candidate for the Africans? I saw a report put out by the British Channel 4, one reporter who looks like East African guy came to a place that looks like Lagos, asking many people about their favorite candidates, and all of them, surprisingly, including a church leader, said Donald Trump. I don't know. Do you think Donald Trump is this popular in Nigeria?
Well, he is actually. He is popular not only in Nigeria, but in some other African countries for a number of reasons. Number one, a lot of people are fed up with the democratic government, especially because of the wars in the Middle East. That is why the Muslims are divided even in the United States. It depends on where you go. I think people in Muslims areas, they obviously don't like Trump because of some of the things that they associated with his past government. But I think Christians, many of them also like Trump. There was a research by Pew Research Center, which I was involved in, from the race. So many people who had a bet Biden in some African countries, including Nigeria, Kenya, and part of Tunisia, for example. So, but like I said, it depends on who we speak to. In Nigeria, many people in Nigeria, especially in the they would rather go for Kamala, even for Biden when he was in there. But now with the Kamala, they'll go for her. Oh,
okay. There's 2 minutes to go. Gina, do you think the Africans are so naive, and especially Nigerians, saying that Donald Trump is their favorite candidate simply because they don't know him as you do? What do you think?
Well, first of all, I want to remind everyone, and I think Hugh re-emphasized that the U.S. election is voted on internal policies. there are not many voters who are thinking globally as they're going to the ballot. They're thinking about the economy. They are thinking about immigration because that has been ratcheted up, and you can talk about that after I'm gone. On it in your intro, women's reproductive rights. At the time that we're recording this, we have 75 million voting. Numbers look like that's about 3-1 for women. Now, we don't precisely how they voted, but it's a good indicator that something is moving them out to the polls. Will it be enough to make a difference for those about 200,000 votes that are going to swing the balance across those 7 significant swing states to go for Trump? I don't know. I don't think anybody has the crystal ball, maybe Alan Lichtman. But for the Africans who are listening, I think there is certainly an undeniable racist undertone to the way that Donald Trump speaks. I think words matter. I work in the leadership space now in corporate and globally, but the words of a leader carry weight, and they form the culture for the environment in which they lead. And certainly we talk about inclusive language, we talk about divisive language. I don't think there's anyone with any form of critical thinking that could say that the way that Donald Trump talks is inclusive. However, as you mentioned, it will remain to be seen as a strong man, strong, unpredictable, but very vigilant person, someone that people want to have in the White House and be the picture at front of the United States in the global arena. We shall see.
Yeah. Do you have hope that the Americans are going to vote for Kamala Harris, despite the fact that it's neck and neck, nobody knows what's going to happen? But then do you have hope?
I always have hope. I think I have hope that a more traditional style of rhetoric and diplomacy will be the way the world goes. I do also have discouragement that the progressive liberal blind view of a lot of leaders has seemed to take almost a free fall with a resurgence of conservative nationalism, isolationism, getting out of science and climate. And I think that could be an indicator, and certainly is what I think is in the future if Donald Trump becomes the president. And with that, I look forward to watching the rest of it. And I look forward to continuing conversations with all of you. And thanks so much, Hugh, for having me on. Bye, Hugh. Bye.
Very nice to meet you. Sorry, I was adamant.
Yeah, definitely. So I'll catch up with you after the election. Definitely. All right. I don't know. So Hugh Fraser, let's talk about this issue. Gina, before she went, was saying that foreign policy doesn't count, and this is the reality in the American politics. It's all about the economy and immigration. And your guy Donald Trump has referred to the Haitian immigrants as those people who eat the people's pets. Let me just quote what he says. My friend has helped me, Musafir, write it. They are eating the cats. They are eating the dogs. I don't want to mimic his voice, but he says they are eating the pets of the people that live there. This person has used racist rhetorics, has said to Kamala Harris, get out, you're fired. This is not substance. This is not what a sensible president or presidential candidate should do when campaigning. He spends a lot of time rumbling about unnecessary, irrelevant stuff when campaigning in front of his supporters.
Well, Trump can speak, which is more than Kamala can do. And he does articulate policies, which is more than... Kamala's only policy is abortion. She has no other policy. And on the case of foreign policy not matching, I think it does. I think Americans are fed up from what I see with what they call the forever wars. And I think it was a very, very big issue in 2016, and I think it is one of Trump's main points is he doesn't start wars, because that very much speaks to the ordinary, what they call the middle classes, what we call the working classes, the people who are sent off to fight in these wars. And I think it's a misunderstanding by what you might call the more sort of liberal elites that that's not an issue. It is an issue with ordinary people. He does have a colourful way of speaking, but interestingly, African Americans and Hispanics voted for him in larger numbers than they've ever voted for a Republican candidate the last election. And all the indications are that they're going to be voting even bigger numbers this time, and that probably a lot of the election depends on African American men. Probably about 40% of them are going to vote for Trump, which is a very, very high. Now, Jean is not here, but she rightfully pointed out the abortion issue, which is Kamala's only policy. Her other policy, which she articulated, was to regulate social media. But I don't think, and I think another thing she might have mentioned but then backtracked on was taxing unrealized gains, which would be kind of the end of the American economic system. But otherwise, she just waffles and calls Trump a Nazi and Hitler and this kind of stuff. So the rhetoric is on both sides. But it's much worse.
His critics,
on the Democrat side.
Yeah, his
it's
critics,
much more extreme against Trump than.
Yeah, so his critics and some of his cabinet members called him Nazi, or referred to some of his actions as Nazi-like actions or rhetorics or something like that. And this is
well, of course, it's ridiculous. It's because they're losing that they're saying that. It's because it's utter fantasy, those kind of comments. And I think everyone sensible knows that Trump doesn't say that. And it's never backed up by people who are there. There are all sorts of wild rumors against him. One of the reasons Trump wins, it will be because of all this ridiculous, extreme rhetoric against him, because using the judicial system again, all the things they accuse him of, Americans can see has been used against him. His opponents on the left are far more extreme
than him. All right.
They show pictures of Nazi rallies and say that's a Trump. It's the things they say and do.
Oh,
Trump has been shot, right? Shot in the ear. The actions, the anti-Trump actions. He's had numerous ridiculous, far-fetched court cases. He's had the entire media calling him Hitler. And you extreme. I'm sorry, but that's just upside down. I mean, in the real world, Trump is the moderate, and they are the extreme. Trump is a moderate, has a
so you're saying that your people in the media,
and they are total extreme.
Yeah, you're saying that your people in the media are the ones demonizing him. Naziru, let me get back to you. You'll be surprised if I play you a couple of voices that I got from some of my listeners. One of them says,
all right, Mr. Endabu, I believe I can have my voice here. For me, I should go for Donald Trump. I wish he would win because, one, he's funny, he's direct and bold, and I like him actually. He's a very good motivational speaker. I like him more than that Kamala Harris. Not personally, but he's my preference. I'd rather go for Donald Trump than Kamala Harris. She's more of an Obama-like. They are hypocrites. They say this, they do this. But Donald Trump says it and does it.
All right. Naziru, this is not the only person who has sent his voice telling me that it's Donald Trump who is their favorite candidate. When you look at this and when you look at the coverage of Donald Trump, which seems especially according to Hugh Fraser, unfavorable of Trump and sort of biased towards him. What could you say
against him?
How our media organizations cover the American election versus how they cover Donald Trump?
Well, so the most of the coverage from the local media in Nigeria and probably other places are not original in the sense that we do not have reporters on. We do not have the capacity and the resources to do. So it largely depends on what major international outlets are reporting, like the New York Times, the CNNs, and the BBCs, and news agents. So like liberal media organizations who shape the coverage and how the outside world perceive the United States or the Western world in general. So we tend to depend on them. So that is why the coverage is largely looking like the way they do it as well, in terms of framing of the candidates and things like that. Most of the people also kind of like use foreign policy in their own assessment of US candidate. But believe me, there are so many other ways that US election could affect us. For
So
example, the issues of
are you trying to say that the way our media organizations
trade and others
politics is by using secondary data, or by feeding our people with secondary data, could sort of be easily manipulated by the media organizations who we sort of lift our stories from? Let's say if most of them are like lifting stories from the CNN types, then we would go for Kamala Harris and Democrat. If we are sourcing from Fox, we would go for, we'll be more favorable towards Donald Trump. And is that problematic? Is that not problematic, journalistically speaking?
Well, I think it's not only about the U.S. Elections coverage. In many other international news coverage, there is this divide and lack of diversity of sources, for example. So these news organizations and agencies have dominated for a very long time. So the narrative that they put in developing countries, so that is a problem. But I'm not saying like they are not coming in. Those they support the party or parties to affect their coverage in one way or another.
Okay. We are running out of time, and in 1 minute, Hugh Fraser, what are your final words? You believe that Donald Trump is winning? I believe that's the words.
I think so. It obviously a big fog has descended over the last few days, but the trend until the very end was a steady indication that Trump will win. But as Gina said, the abortion issue is very big in America, and women voters, there are 55% of the population are women. So there is that factor X in it, which makes it slightly unclear. But I think at this point you have to discount the polls and just use your common sense of what's happened. But Trump has run a much better campaign, and Kamala Harris, we haven't spoken about it, but has been a terrible and very weak candidate, probably the worst candidate in history. So they don't even try to promote her anymore. They just attack Trump. So I think the Democrats have given up on Kamala Harris as a positive candidate, and they're just hoping the abortion issue will carry them through.
Yeah, sure. Nazir Mikailu, your final words before we go. Definitely we need to come back, inshallah.
So we hope we're hoping for outcome to the election. This is not a kind of votes that you rarely associate with the American election, but looking at what happened in the kind of rhetoric that they've been using during campaigns. So you have to say that. But I'm not, so I don't have like a particular candidate, but I think we hope democracy and humanity wins at the end.
Well, thank you very much.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed, Nazir Mikailu and Hugh Fraser, and many thanks to Gina London. Currently,
thank you to Gina. Sorry, I said.
Yeah, definitely. we need to come back after the election. On behalf of everyone that has contributed to the production of the show, Nazir Mikailu from London, University of Westminster, and Hugh Fraser from Oxford. On behalf of everyone that has contributed to the production of the show, my name is Umar Isa Dendigo, saying goodbye and see you very soon. Bye-bye.
Bye. Cheerio.